The sound didn't crash, it detonated, a violent metallic concussion that ripped through the valley and then vanished, leaving behind a silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums. Dust hung in the air like frozen smoke. At the center of it all sat the wreckage of Deputy Carl Hensley's HOA patrol truck, a twisted mass of chrome and ego folded inward, as if the road itself had finally snapped. I didn't rush. I didn't shout. I stood there, calm, watching the fake authority parasite crawl out of the driver's side, screaming about sabotage, murder, and lawsuits, his power-drunk fantasy collapsing in real time. This wasn't an accident. This was the end of a long intimidation campaign that had finally met something it couldn't bully. For months, Carl Hensley had treated my property like a training course for his wannabe cop routine, smashing my mailbox over and over, as if destruction itself was a citation he could issue. He wore the HOA badge like a weapon, used his truck like a battering ram, and assumed the land would always yield the way people usually did when he showed up. But when his truck stopped dead and the earth went quiet, something fundamental shifted. He screamed. He accused. He flailed. And I stayed still. Because control looks like silence when the abuser finally loses momentum. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Because what happened next didn't just end his power trip, it rewrote the rules he thought he owned. The dust settled slowly, revealing the truth in brutal clarity. His front end was destroyed. The engine bay looked like it had been punched inward by an invisible fist. Coolant bled onto the gravel like a confession. The horn wailed without rhythm, a dying animal noise that matched his unraveling voice. And standing perfectly vertical, untouched by the chaos, was my mailbox post. Not bent, not cracked. Still, solid. Watching him realize that the intimidation attempt he'd repeated so casually had finally backfired was almost clinical, like observing a controlled experiment reach its inevitable conclusion. He had trespassed one too many times, and physics had revoked his privilege. Carl staggered, red-faced and furious, pointing at me as if volume could rewrite reality. He yelled about booby traps and ambushes, about how people like me shouldn't be allowed to live out here unsupervised. The neighbors began to appear at the edges of the road, drawn by the noise, by the spectacle of a power-drunk board enforcer stripped of his costume. I could feel their eyes shifting, not toward him, but toward the post that had stopped his truck cold. The authority he relied on thrived in private intimidation, not public exposure. And now every lie he'd told himself about being untouchable was bleeding out onto the gravel. He kept shouting, demanding someone arrest me, threatening to bring the full weight of the HOA cult down on my head, but the words sounded hollow now, bouncing uselessly off a scene he could no longer control. The truth was obvious even before anyone spoke it. He had left the road. He had entered my property. He had used his vehicle as a tool of harassment escalation, and it had failed. That realization hit him harder than the impact itself, and I saw it in his eyes, the first flicker of fear where entitlement used to live. But that's not even the half of it, because this moment didn't come out of nowhere. Weeks earlier, the pattern had already been set. The first mailbox smash was framed as an accident, a careless drift, a shrug, and a warning that my property leaned too close to his imaginary boundary. The second time, it was blamed on visibility, on safety, on fake enforcement jargon designed to sound official enough to scare compliance out of me. By the third impact, when the box was torn clean from its post and thrown into the ditch like garbage, the message was unmistakable. This was abuse of authority dressed up as maintenance. This was home invasion behavior executed at speed. And Carl Hensley enjoyed it, enjoyed knowing he could destroy something of mine and drive away laughing under the cover of HOA paperwork. I documented everything: dates, times, tire tracks. Each trespassing violation was logged while he assumed I was retreating. Every intimidation attempt fed into the same calm calculation. He mistook silence for submission, and that miscalculation would cost him more than a repair bill. The mailbox became the focal point of his obsession, the symbol he needed to erase to prove his dominance. He believed that if he could keep smashing it, I would eventually fold, move it, disappear. He never considered the possibility that I was letting him commit to the pattern, letting him escalate until the evidence was undeniable. The night of the crash, the conditions were perfect for his arrogance. Dusk blurred the edges of the road. The gravel still held heat. His truck came in fast, engine roaring with the confidence of someone who had never been stopped before. I watched from a distance as he lined up the familiar approach, the subtle veer off the center line, the deliberate correction that aimed him straight at the post. This time there was no hesitation, no pretense. He committed fully, expecting the same cheap crunch of wood and surrender. Instead, the road answered back with finality. Here's where everything blew apart, not just mechanically, but psychologically. When his truck stopped instantly, when the illusion shattered, the quiet that followed was absolute. The valley didn't echo with his authority anymore. It absorbed it. The neighbors saw it. They saw a fake cop reduced to noise and wreckage by his own escalation. They saw that the rules he claimed to enforce didn't protect him when he broke them himself. I didn't need to raise my voice or explain a thing. The scene explained itself. His intimidation attempt had crossed into public humiliation, and there was no reversing that trajectory. As he continued to unravel, threatening lawsuits and arrests that no longer carried weight, I could feel the shift solidifying. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about boundaries, about the moment when abuse of authority meets something immovable. Carl Hensley had built his persona on the assumption that no one would ever push back, that fear would always be cheaper than resistance. Standing there, watching his power-drunk meltdown play out under open sky, I knew that assumption had just been destroyed, along with his front axle. The sirens were already on their way, distant but inevitable, and the crowd along the road grew thicker. With every passing second, Carl's voice cracked as he realized this wasn't a private confrontation he could spin. This was a public reckoning. I stayed exactly where I was, hands relaxed, posture neutral, letting the silence do the work he never understood. Because once the intimidation fails and the witnesses arrive, the power trip doesn't just end, it collapses. And this was only the beginning of what his own actions were about to unleash. The mailbox didn't start as a symbol of defiance. It started as a boundary, quiet and unremarkable, planted decades earlier by my father when this land was still treated with respect. He set it where the county survey said it belonged, measured it twice, tamped the soil down with the heel of his boot, and never thought about it again. That was how things worked out here. You put something where it was legal, where it made sense, and you expected others to mind their own business. For years, nobody touched it. Mail came. Mail went. Life moved forward. That changed the moment Carl Hensley decided he wasn't just an HOA employee, but the law itself. Carl didn't move into the area the way most people did. He arrived like an occupying force. New truck, new uniform, new sense of entitlement that didn't match the dirt under his tires. He introduced himself as HOA Compliance Enforcement, a phrase that sounded official enough to scare people who didn't know better. No badge, no sworn authority, just a laminated ID and the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. He drove the easement like it was his patrol route, slowed down in front of properties he didn't approve of, and lingered just long enough to let people know they were being watched. Backyard stalker behavior disguised as community standards. I noticed him the first week, not because he spoke to me, but because he kept circling. Every time I stepped outside, his truck seemed to be idling somewhere nearby. When I worked late, his headlights crept past the fence line. He never waved, never nodded. He wanted to be noticed without engaging, the oldest intimidation trick in the book. I didn't react. I kept working. Silence frustrates men like Carl because it denies them feedback. It took less than a month for that frustration to turn into action. The first notice came taped to my gate, not mailed, not delivered properly. A warning about non-compliant roadside structures. No statute cited, no ordinance number. Just language meant to sound threatening. I looked it over calmly and filed it away. The second notice mentioned the mailbox specifically, claiming it was a visual obstruction and a safety concern. That's when I pulled the county code and verified what I already knew. The box was legal. The setback was correct. The easement boundary wasn't even close. Carl didn't care about compliance, he cared about control. And control requires a target. Carl's mistake was assuming I was isolated. He assumed rural meant ignorant. He assumed quiet meant weak. What he didn't know was that I'd spent years dealing with permits, surveys, inspectors, and agencies that actually had teeth. I understood how authority worked when it was real, and how fragile it became when it was fake. That's why I didn't confront him immediately. Men like Carl feed on confrontation. They escalate when challenged early. Instead, I let him talk. I let him posture. I let him commit his behavior to a record he didn't realize he was creating. The first time he hit the mailbox, he didn't even stop. Just a crunch of metal and wood, followed by the roar of his engine pulling away. When I walked down to inspect it, the box was bent, the post cracked. Tire marks cut off the road and into my grass. Clear trespassing violation. I photographed everything, time-stamped it, logged the angle of approach. He showed up later that afternoon, smirking, and told me it was an accident. Claimed the road was narrow, suggested I move the box back before something worse happened. That wasn't advice. That was a threat wrapped in fake concern. I replaced the post with the same materials, same location, same measurements. I didn't say a word to him. That silence irritated him more than any argument could have. 2 weeks later, he did it again, harder this time. The box was torn clean off and thrown into the ditch. This time he stopped long enough to take pictures. Posted them to the HOA group chat with a caption about hazards and maintenance. That was when I knew this wasn't going to end with compliance. This was harassment escalation. Deliberate and public. The HOA board backed him without question. Power-drunk board members who loved having an enforcer willing to do the dirty work they couldn't be seen doing. They sent letters echoing his language, referencing safety without citing law, hinting at fines that didn't exist. I responded once, formally, citing the county code and postal regulations. They never replied. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't interested in being right. They were interested in being feared. And fear only works until it doesn't. Carl grew bolder when he realized the board wouldn't restrain him. He started driving faster, closer. The mailbox became his routine stop, his nightly reminder that he could cross onto my land without consequence. Each impact was more aggressive than the last. Each one reinforced his belief that intimidation was working. Meanwhile, my file grew thicker. Photos, videos, measurements, witness statements from neighbors who'd started noticing his behavior. He thought he was conditioning me to surrender. In reality, he was conditioning the outcome. And I positioned myself carefully, Calm on the surface, cooperative when spoken to, never reactive. That posture confused him. Abusers expect fear or rage. When they get neither, they escalate to provoke it. That's exactly what Carl did. He started referring to himself as HOA cop openly, flashing his ID like a badge, talking about citations and arrests he couldn't legally issue. Fake enforcement thrives on borrowed language. The more he talked, the more exposed he became. There was a moment, standing over the broken mailbox one morning, when I realized he had already crossed every line that mattered. He had trespassed repeatedly. He had destroyed property intentionally. He had documented his own misconduct. And he had done it under the assumption that the system would protect him. That assumption was his power position, not strength, not law, just confidence that nobody would force the issue. That's when the dynamic flipped. Because once you understand where someone's power actually comes from, dismantling it becomes a matter of patience, not emotion. I didn't rebuild the mailbox immediately after the third smash. I left it down longer than usual. Let the absent speak. Carl noticed. He slowed his patrol. Drove past more often. He thought the gap meant victory. What he didn't realize was that I was repositioning, not retreating. I was done playing defense. The mailbox had served its purpose as bait. Now it was time to turn the pattern into a conclusion. That decision didn't come from anger. It came from clarity. The realization that compliance wouldn't end the abuse, it would reward it. Carl had shown me exactly who he was through repetition. He had upgraded his behavior every time he wasn't stopped. That meant the next escalation was inevitable. And when it came, it wouldn't be subtle. It would be loud, public, impossible to explain away. I didn't need to imagine what he would do next. He'd already rehearsed it for me over and over, with my mailbox as his target. All I had to do now was make sure the next time he crossed that boundary, it would be the last time he ever did. Once Carl Hensley realized nobody was stepping in to stop him, his behavior shifted from casual intimidation into something more organized, more deliberate. That change didn't happen in isolation. It was enabled. The HOA wasn't a loose collection of neighbors anymore. It had hardened into a small cult of authority addicts who mistook paperwork for power and titles for immunity. Carl was their blunt instrument, the one willing to cross physical lines so they could pretend their hands stayed clean. And every time he smashed my mailbox without consequence, the board learned they could push further too. The board meetings were never publicized properly, only shared among a tight circle that already agreed with itself. When minutes were recorded, they were vague to the point of uselessness. Language like road safety concerns and visual compliance issues floated around without reference to any real statute. That vagueness was intentional. It allowed Carl to act while giving the board plausible deniability. They didn't order him to trespass. They simply supported enforcement efforts. That's how abuse of authority survives. It never speaks plainly. It hides behind suggestion. Carl started showing up with printed forms that looked official at a glance. Bold headers, fine print, threatening language about fines and liens. None of it enforceable, none of it legal. But legality wasn't the goal. Compliance through fear was. He would leave the papers tucked under my mailbox flag, or wedged into the broken wood after another accidental impact. A physical reminder that he could touch my property whenever he wanted. That's home invasion behavior, even when it wears a clipboard instead of a mask. Neighbors began whispering. Not openly at first. Quiet questions at the feed store. Long looks when Carl's truck idled too long at someone else's driveway. They'd seen him harass others, but never this persistently. Most people moved their boxes, trimmed their hedges, paid whatever fine he invented just to make him go away. That pattern emboldened him. It taught him that pressure worked. It also taught the board that he was effective. Effectiveness, to people like them, mattered more than legality. The escalation became routine. Carl stopped pretending the mailbox hits were accidents. He joked about them in the HOA chat, posting grainy photos with captions about learning opportunities. He framed destruction as education. That rhetorical shift mattered. It meant he no longer feared being contradicted. He believed the board would rewrite reality for him if necessary. And they did. When one neighbor questioned the legality of smashing private property, the comment disappeared within minutes. The thread was locked. Silence enforced digitally to match the intimidation happening on the ground. I attended one meeting quietly, sitting in the back, listening. Carl spoke with authority he didn't have, using words like jurisdiction and enforcement as if repeating them enough times would make them true. The board nodded along. When I asked a single question about easement boundaries and county code, the room went cold. Not angry, defensive. That reaction told me everything. They weren't ignorant, they knew, and they were choosing abuse anyway. After that meeting, Carl's behavior sharpened. He began parking his truck partially on my land, just enough to cross the line, daring me to say something. He revved the engine when he passed. He stared openly. Surveillance creep tactics meant to provoke a response he could escalate against. This was no longer about the mailbox alone. It was about dominance, about showing that he could violate boundaries repeatedly without consequence. That's when I understood the structure clearly. Carl wasn't rogue. He was the visible arm of a system that relied on exhaustion and fear. The board sent a certified letter soon after, claiming my mailbox posed an ongoing safety hazard and instructing me to relocate it farther back from the road. No measurements, no citations, just an order. I compared it to the county survey and laughed quietly to myself. What they were demanding would actually violate postal regulations. They weren't just wrong. They were setting a trap of their own, hoping I'd comply and lose mail delivery. It was a siege tactic, bureaucratic instead of violent, but just as invasive. Carl followed up in person, standing at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, blocking the easement with his truck. He told me this was my final warning, said the board was tired of my resistance. Resistance. As if existing within my rights was rebellion. He leaned in close enough that I could smell the stale coffee on his breath and told me accidents tend to get worse when people don't cooperate. That was the first time he said it out loud. A direct intimidation attempt. No euphemisms, no paperwork, just threat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I told him to leave my property. He smirked and took his time doing it, tires chewing up gravel as he pulled away. That interaction marked another upgrade in behavior. He had moved from property destruction to personal intimidation, from object to occupant. The board didn't discipline him. They praised his decisiveness in the next email blast. That was the moment the HOA mafia revealed itself fully. They weren't interested in rules. They were interested in submission. From that point on, everything Carl did felt rehearsed. The timing of his drive-bys, the angle of his approaches, the consistency of his mailbox strikes. He was building a narrative where my property was the problem and he was the solution. That narrative only works if no one challenges it with evidence. He assumed nobody would. He assumed rural meant unrecorded. He assumed wrong. I began noticing how carefully he avoided witnesses when possible, how he struck early mornings or late evenings when the road was empty. That avoidance told me he understood, at least subconsciously, that public exposure was his weakness. Abuse thrives in isolation. Collapse happens under observation. The board's power functioned the same way. Closed meetings, deleted comments, private warnings, everything hidden just enough to deny accountability. By now, the mailbox was no longer the issue. It was the excuse. The real conflict was between unchecked authority and a boundary that refused to disappear. Carl had invested too much of his identity into enforcing that boundary away. If he backed down, he'd expose himself as what he really was, a fake cop with no power outside the fear he generated. That sunk cost desperation drove him harder, made his actions less cautious. The final warning letter from the board arrived the same week Carl escalated his drive-bys into full-speed runs. He clipped the shoulder intentionally, tires cutting into my grass, daring the mailbox to be there. He wanted a bigger impact, a more dramatic show of dominance. The structure that supported him encouraged it. No one called him off. No one asked questions. They assumed the pattern would continue indefinitely. What they didn't understand was that systems built on intimidation collapse when confronted with certainty. Carl thought the board protected him. The board thought Carl absorbed the risk for them. Neither realized that once the behavior crossed into undeniable proof, they would scatter. That's how HOA cults operate. Loud together, silent alone. And Carl was about to find out exactly how fast that silence arrives when the power. By the end of that week, the dynamic was locked. Carl believed he was untouchable. The board believed he was effective. The neighbors believed someone needed to stop him. And I believed the next escalation was guaranteed. The only variable left was how visible the collapse would be. I had no interest in a quiet resolution. Quiet is what protected them for so long. What was coming needed witnesses, and Carl, driven by his own entitlement, was more than willing to provide the final demonstration himself. Once I accepted that the HOA power structure wasn't going to restrain Carl, my focus shifted away from endurance and toward exposure. Intimidation only survives as long as it can pretend to be ambiguous. The moment intent becomes provable, the entire house of cards starts to sway. I didn't need to out-argue Carl or out-yell him. I needed to let him document his own collapse. That meant preparation, patience, and precision. This wasn't about revenge yet. This was about control. The first thing I did was remeasure everything. Not once, not casually. I pulled the county survey, printed it, and staked the easement boundaries myself. I measured the mailbox location down to the inch, photographed the tape in frame, and cross-referenced it with postal setback guidelines. I wanted redundancy. I wanted clarity so clean it couldn't be spun. The mailbox wasn't leaning into the road. It wasn't close to the travel lane. It wasn't a hazard. The only way to hit it was to leave the road deliberately. That mattered more than anything Carl had said. Then I upgraded my eyes. The old camera had done its job, but grainy footage leaves room for denial. Carl relied on that gap. So I closed it. I installed a high-definition camera with a wide angle and night capability, mounted high enough to capture approach, steering input, tire position, and license plate in the same frame. I tested it repeatedly, day and night, adjusting angles until there was no blind spot left. I wasn't spying. I was documenting repeated trespassing violations. There's a difference, and the law recognizes it. The footage didn't take long to collect. Within days, Carl delivered exactly what I needed. The first clip showed him approaching at speed, centered in the lane, then making a sharp, deliberate correction toward the shoulder. No obstacle. No oncoming traffic. No brake lights. The second clip was even clearer. You could see his hands turn the wheel. You could see the tires cross the boundary line. You could see the impact. Not an accident, not negligence, intent. I watched the footage once, then archived it. I didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. He didn't deserve that courtesy anymore. At the same time, I started building a timeline. every incident logged, every warning letter scanned, every HOA email saved. I matched dates with footage and photographs. I noted escalation patterns, how the hits got harder and more aggressive over time. That pattern told a story no amount of posturing could erase. This wasn't random damage. This was harassment escalation, systematic and repeated. The kind of behavior that looks trivial in isolation and damning in sequence. I also started talking quietly to neighbors. Not emotionally, factually. I showed them still frames, tire tracks, timestamps. Most of them didn't look surprised. They looked relieved. They had their own stories. Fines that vanished when challenged. Threats that evaporated when witnesses appeared. Carl had been counting on isolation. What he didn't realize was that his behavior had already united people against him. They just needed proof, solid enough to stand on. One neighbor gave me something even more valuable. A statement. He'd seen Carl swerve intentionally more than once. He'd watched him laugh about it afterward. He was willing to put his name on that memory. That turned a pattern into corroboration. I didn't need 10 witnesses. I needed one who was credible and calm. That's how cases are built. Not with outrage, but with consistency. I reviewed every possible angle Carl might try to use. Safety, visibility, road width, emergency access. None of it held up under scrutiny. The road was wide enough. The mailbox was visible. Emergency vehicles passed without issue daily. His justifications collapsed the moment they were measured against reality. That's when I understood something important. Carl wasn't acting recklessly. He was acting confidently. He believed the system would cushion him no matter how hard he pushed. That belief made him predictable. The predictability extended to timing. He favored dusk, low light, fewer cars. Enough visibility to aim, not enough to be noticed. Once I saw that pattern, the next step became obvious. If I wanted undeniable proof, I needed to let him do exactly what he always did, but under conditions he couldn't later explain away. Full visibility, clean footage, clear intent, no ambiguity. That meant rebuilding the mailbox, but not the way he expected. The replacement wasn't immediate. I waited. Let the absence gnaw at him. He slowed his patrols, then increased them, checking to see if I'd surrendered. When the new post finally appeared, it looked ordinary. Rustic, wooden, harmless. Exactly what he thought he'd already beaten before. That was intentional. He needed to believe the pattern would repeat. Abusers rely on predictability. I gave him exactly that illusion. I double-checked legality one last time. Setback measured, materials compliant, classification accurate. Fence post. Not a barrier, not an obstruction. A fence post that happened to hold mail. That distinction mattered more than Carl could ever imagine. I documented the installation process itself. Photographs showing depth, placement, and compliance. If anyone questioned intent, I could show mine had always been lawful. The camera went live the moment the concrete cured. I synced the feed to my phone and tested notifications. No delay, no blur, no excuses. The system was ready. At that point, the outcome stopped feeling uncertain. It felt scheduled. Carl had escalated every time without fail. He had never backed down. He had never chosen restraint. The board had rewarded him for aggression. There was no reason to believe he would suddenly change. That realization didn't bring satisfaction. It brought focus. Because once you see exactly how someone will behave, you stop reacting and start setting conditions. I wasn't waiting to see if he would hit the mailbox again. I was waiting to record how he did it. The discovery phase was complete. The proof was already stacked. All that remained was the moment when his confidence carried him into something immovable. And that moment was coming fast. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or warnings. It arrived the way it always did with Carl Hensley, on 4 oversized tires and a sense of entitlement so loud it announced itself before the engine noise ever did. The sun was dropping low, that deceptive hour when shadows stretch and depth blurs, and the road looks softer than it really is. I was standing back from the easement, not hiding, not hovering, just present enough to observe. The new mailbox stood exactly where the old one had, looking harmless, wooden, familiar. To Carl, it must have looked like surrender wrapped in tradition. He didn't slow down. The camera notification hit my phone seconds before the sound reached my ears. His truck came into frame exactly as expected, centered in the lane, suspension bouncing slightly from speed. There was no traffic, no animals, no obstacle forcing a correction. Then came the movement I'd seen on every clip before. The wheel turned. The tires crossed the boundary. The truck left the road. This time he didn't even pretend it was accidental. He committed fully, accelerating as if force itself could rewrite the outcome. That was the moment when intimidation turned into proof. The impact wasn't gradual. It was instant and absolute. The front of the truck folded inward like it had hit a wall, not wood. The sound cracked through the air, sharp and violent, followed by a silence so sudden it felt artificial. The engine died mid-roar. Steam hissed. Fluid spilled. The horn began blaring without rhythm, trapped in a short circuit that mirrored Carl's own mental state. Gravel settled around the wreckage as the truth stood exposed in the middle of the scene. The post hadn't moved. Not an inch. Carl stumbled out of the cab in a storm of noise and rage. He was bleeding from the face, fury distorting his features as he took in the impossible. His truck was destroyed. His authority costume had failed him. He started shouting immediately, accusing me of sabotage, screaming about booby traps and attempted murder. His voice carried down the road, loud enough to summon witnesses. That was the first crack in his control. He needed the confrontation to stay private. Instead, it was turning into a spectacle. Neighbors began to appear, drawn by the noise and the flashing hazards of a totaled vehicle. They stood at a distance at first, then closer, forming a quiet semicircle around the scene. No one rushed to Carl's defense. No one joined his accusations. They looked at the tire tracks. They looked at the post. They looked at the position of the truck. The geometry told a story Carl couldn't interrupt. The intimidation attempt had escalated into something undeniable, and everyone could see it. Carl kept talking, louder now, layering threat over threat, promising arrests, lawsuits, and consequences he no longer had the power to deliver. He pointed at me repeatedly, trying to turn the crowd into an audience for his authority. It didn't work. The more he spoke, the more unhinged he sounded. His words no longer landed with fear. They landed with discomfort. People don't trust a man yelling about power while standing next to the wreckage of his own decisions. The sheriff's sirens cut through the tension not long after, red and blue lights washing over the gravel and metal. Carl's posture shifted the moment he saw them. Confidence drained into panic. He rushed toward the approaching cruiser, waving his arms, trying to seize the narrative before the scene could speak for itself. He talked fast, stumbling over explanations, claiming I'd set a trap in the road. He didn't mention leaving the lane. He didn't mention the repeated prior hits. He avoided the facts because the facts were lethal to his story. When the deputy stepped out and took in the scene, he didn't look at me first. He looked at the tracks. He looked at the post. He looked at the truck. That order mattered. Carl kept talking, interrupting, insisting on his HOA authority, demanding action. The deputy raised a hand and told him to step back. That single gesture hit harder than any argument could have. Carl obeyed, visibly rattled. For the first time since he'd arrived in this neighborhood, Someone with real authority wasn't impressed. The deputy asked simple questions. Where were you driving? Why did you leave the road? Why are there no skid marks? Carl's answers tangled over each other, each one contradicting the last. He tried blaming wildlife, then lighting, then the mailbox itself. Each excuse collapsed under inspection. The camera footage played on my phone, clear and unmistakable. Steering input. Boundary crossed. Acceleration impact. No accident. No ambiguity. The deputy didn't need commentary. The video did the talking. As the crowd watched, Carl's voice dropped from rage to desperation. He began attacking my character instead, calling me dangerous, unstable, obsessed. That shift told everyone exactly who he was. When intimidation fails, humiliation takes its place. The neighbors didn't react. They didn't need to. Silence can be more condemning than shouting, and Carl was drowning in it. The HOA board president arrived late, breathless and panicked, trying to insert himself between Carl and the deputy. He spoke about misunderstandings, about ongoing disputes, about enforcement authority that didn't exist. The deputy shut him down without ceremony, reminding him this was a trespassing and property damage investigation, not an HOA meeting. That moment fractured the illusion the board had built. Their power only functioned in rooms they controlled. Out here, under lights and cameras, it evaporated. Carl watched that exchange with wide eyes. The realization hit him in stages. First, that the board wasn't protecting him. Second, that the witnesses weren't intimidated. Third, that the evidence was complete. His posture collapsed inward, shoulders sagging, hands shaking. The power-drunk enforcer who had terrorized the road with confidence now stood exposed as exactly what he was. A man who believed rules only applied to others. When the deputy told him to sit on the bumper of the cruiser, the humiliation was total, not shouted, not dramatized, just executed. The crowd saw it. The board saw it. Carl saw it. His authority had not just been challenged, it had been publicly dismantled. And as the night settled in around the wreckage, one thing became clear to everyone present. The intimidation campaign was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Once the noise settled and the adrenaline drained out of the scene, the shift from chaos to consequence happened quietly, the way real accountability always does. Carl Hensley had spent months weaponizing confusion, counting on intimidation to blur facts. That strategy collapsed the moment professionals stepped in. The deputy didn't argue with him. He didn't lecture. He asked questions, wrote notes, and let the evidence box Carl into a corner he couldn't posture his way out of. That calm efficiency was more damaging to Carl than any raised voice could have been. The first blow landed when the deputy walked the scene again with fresh eyes, measuring distance from the road, photographing tire tracks, documenting the absence of skid marks. Each step stripped another layer off Carl's narrative. The mailbox wasn't in the roadway. The post wasn't an obstruction. The damage path showed deliberate departure from the easement. Carl tried interrupting, but the deputy shut it down with a look that said this part wasn't for him anymore. The authority he'd borrowed was being repossessed in real time. Then came the insurance side, and that was where Carl's confidence truly began to crack. The adjuster arrived the next morning, not rushed, not impressed, methodical in the way only someone used to unraveling lies can be. He walked around the truck, knelt by the tires, studied the angle of impact. He asked for statements. He watched the footage. Twice. Slowly. Carl hovered nearby, trying to frame it as an accident, a safety issue, anything that would trigger coverage. The adjuster didn't react. He didn't need to. The policy language did the work for him. Intentional acts Accidents aren't accidents. That single clause gutted Carl's safety net. The footage showed steering input, acceleration, targeted impact. The adjuster explained it plainly, without malice. If you use a vehicle as a tool of intimidation, coverage evaporates. The truck was Carl's responsibility. The cleanup costs were Carl's responsibility. The property damage claim would be Carl's responsibility. Carl went quiet for the first time since the crash, the weight of numbers finally landing harder than the impact ever had. The HOA board tried distancing itself immediately. Emails went unanswered. Calls stopped being returned. The president released a carefully worded statement claiming Carl had acted independently, outside the scope of his role. That move didn't help them. It exposed them. Their earlier messages, their endorsements, their silence during escalation all lived in my records. The deputy requested copies. The adjuster requested copies. What the board had treated as internal chatter was now evidence of encouragement and negligence. Carl attempted one last play. He claimed medical issues, claimed stress, claimed misunderstanding. He framed himself as overwhelmed, pressured, trying to do his job. None of it stuck. The pattern was too clear, too consistent. Experts don't care about excuses when timelines line up. His behavior had escalated predictably. The documentation showed intent. The witnesses confirmed it. His voice, once loud and domineering, became small and brittle, each sentence less confident than the last. By the end of the second day, the outcome wasn't in question anymore. Citations were issued, reports were filed. The insurance denial was formalized. The HOA board was advised to seek counsel, not to protect Carl, but to protect themselves. That advisory alone told me everything I needed to know about how far the situation had shifted. The system Carl thought would shield him was now insulating itself from him instead. I watched it all from a distance, not celebrating, not intervening. This wasn't my fight anymore. It had moved beyond personal conflict into institutional consequence. Carl had forced that transition himself through repetition and arrogance. Every expert involved treated the situation the same way. Calm, precise, unemotional. That uniform response was devastating to someone who thrived on reaction. When Carl finally left the scene days later, his truck towed away, his role suspended, his reputation shredded, he didn't look at me. He couldn't. The humiliation wasn't loud anymore. It was heavy. The kind that settles into posture and silence. He'd spent months projecting power. Now he was absorbing the reality of what happens when fake authority collides with documentation and daylight. The retaliation wasn't personal. That's what made it complete. It came from systems Carl had tried to impersonate and manipulate. Law enforcement, insurance, regulatory frameworks he never bothered to understand because he assumed fear would always be enough. Watching those systems close in on him without drama was the most satisfying part of the entire ordeal. Not because he suffered, but because the imbalance he'd created was finally corrected. By the time the dust fully cleared, Carl Hensley was no longer an enforcer. He was a liability everyone wanted distance from. The HOA board stopped using his name. Neighbors stopped whispering. The road went quiet again. And standing exactly where it always had, untouched by the collapse it caused, was the mailbox post. Waiting, stable, silent. The last thing Carl would ever run into again. After Carl Hensley disappeared from the road, the quiet that followed wasn't immediate relief. It was heavier than that. It was the kind of silence that settles only after something toxic has been removed and the space it occupied is still recalibrating. No engine roared past at dusk anymore. No headlights slowed at my gate. No clipboard parasite lingered just long enough to be seen. The absence itself became confirmation. The intimidation had ended because the intimidator no longer existed in any meaningful way. The HOA board went quiet too. Not defiantly, not officially, but instinctively. Emails stopped. Notices stopped. Meetings were postponed and then quietly restructured. The board president resigned within a month, citing personal reasons that everyone understood without needing explanation. The remaining members stripped the enforcement role down to nothing, rewriting bylaws to remove any illusion of authority they had previously enjoyed. They didn't announce these changes publicly. They didn't apologize. They simply retreated, hoping silence would erase memory. It didn't. It just marked surrender. Carl never filed another complaint, never sent another letter, never attempted to reclaim the narrative. His name vanished from HOA correspondence entirely, scrubbed like a liability nobody wanted attached to them. When people asked what happened to him, the answers were vague and short. He moved on. He left the area. The truth was simpler. His power trip ended the moment it became visible. Once witnesses saw what he really was, there was nowhere left for him to stand. The mailbox stayed exactly where it was. I didn't rebuild it to look friendly. I didn't soften it. I left it exposed, honest, scarred from impact but perfectly upright. A fixed point in a place that had been destabilized by arrogance. People noticed. They slowed down when they passed it. Some stared. A few nodded. Nobody touched it. Not once. Respect returned without being requested. Weeks later, a county inspector stopped by unannounced. Not hostile, not suspicious. Curious. He measured. He checked the records. He looked at the post. Then at me. He said everything was in compliance and left without another word. That was the final authority beat, delivered without ceremony. The system had spoken clearly, and it was done. Life resumed its rhythm after that. Workdays passed uninterrupted. Evenings settled without tension. The land felt like mine again, not something under observation or threat. That restoration didn't feel triumphant. It felt correct, as if something had been misaligned and finally snapped back into place. Power belongs where it's earned, not where it's claimed loudly. I saw Carl once more, months later, by chance. He was in town, standing near a gas station, driving a smaller vehicle, posture hunched, eyes fixed anywhere but forward. He didn't recognize me at first. When he did, he looked away immediately. No words, no gestures, just avoidance. The kind that comes when someone knows there's nothing left to say and no ground left to stand on. Not one of them could look me in the eye. The neighbors changed too. Conversations became easier. People stopped whispering. Boundaries were respected without enforcement. The HOA cult had lost its teeth, and everyone knew it. Fear evaporates quickly when it's exposed as hollow. What replaced it wasn't rebellion or chaos, it was normalcy, the kind Carl had disrupted because he couldn't stand not being central to it. I never spoke publicly about what happened. I didn't post updates. I didn't recount the story unless someone asked directly. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a conclusion. The humiliation Carl experienced didn't need amplification. It was already complete. He had built his identity on dominance, and that identity collapsed under its own weight the moment it met resistance that couldn't be bullied. Standing by the mailbox one evening, watching the light shift across the gravel road, I understood something clearly. The system didn't fail me. It simply required certainty, documentation, patience. The moment those pieces aligned, the abuse of authority unraveled on its own. No shouting, no dramatics. Just consequences arriving exactly where they belonged. The land doesn't care about titles. It doesn't recognize fake enforcement or power-drunk fantasies. It responds to force, weight, and truth. Carl forgot that. He assumed momentum was the same thing as authority. He assumed speed equaled control. He learned too late that momentum without direction ends in collision. I left the mailbox as it was intentionally, not as a warning, as a reminder, not to others, but to myself. Boundaries don't announce themselves. They don't negotiate. They simply exist. And when someone repeatedly violates them, the outcome isn't emotional. It's mechanical. Nothing dramatic happened after that. No final confrontation. No last word. Just quiet compliance where intimidation used to live. Just absence where harassment used to breathe. The kind of ending that doesn't feel loud because it doesn't need to. The power trip ended instantly.